Alright everybody, so I finally got my Uber account reactivated. It took about 11 days for the investigation team to figure out what was obvious, that the person's claim was outrageous. But it was even worse than I thought, because the person said that I had a heart attack and I was taken into the hospital like outside by paramedics. Of course, probably the exaggeration on their side, on the passenger side, made it hard to believe their story. They said I had a heart attack while driving and I was taken into the hospital. Well, Uber knows that I kept driving that night after I dropped that passenger off, so that person is a very bad, very vengeful person. They got my account suspended for 11 days. That was very vengeful. Lucky for me, I have the YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel makes me a lot more than the Uber ever will. In fact, I was able to make some great videos for my YouTube channel and go fishing for a few days and contemplate life a little bit better. But it's crazy to think how one vengeful passenger can have you taken out of service for 11 days. I mean, I'm definitely going to use the dash cam on most passengers. I mean, there's passengers where you can tell they're not going to be problematic, but there's passengers where you get that feeling, and for those people, they're going to get the dash cam. And I don't give a crap how it makes them feel. Unfortunately, one passenger lying took me out for 11 days. We had the floods where, I have a pickup truck. It could have been a great asset to the community, me having this truck working. But because of one vengeful person's lie, I was out of service for a while. She definitely exaggerated and lied to the Uber team, and her lies were not really, couldn't prove them. So I was very close to one ride and I accepted it, but somebody else got it before I did, and I wasn't able to get to it. So, but it's interesting that we're in a price surge nearby, and nobody's actually needing a ride. This is kind of interesting. We'll see what happens, but as of now, I'm just gonna sit here and wait for the ride if it comes. I've been here for 20 minutes now waiting for a ride, and that's the thing about Uber driving in Florida right now, is that it's difficult. You don't get as many passengers as you think you would. So alright, so as typical, I'll give you guys a summary of the day's driving. We're going to start off here on Siesta Key, but overall I had 5.5 hours of driving. I took 9 people to their destination, making a total of $117. 21 of that money was tips and $11 were surcharge. That brings the day's driving average to $21.27. That really doesn't sound like a lot of money, except for things have been so economically difficult after missing 11 days of Uber driving that I am glad I was making something versus nothing. So here's one of the passengers that I picked up on Siesta Key. Now these were people from out of state. They're tourists. They were vacationing here. And now I'm driving them all the way back to North Sarasota to their hotel. So this is Siesta Key. This area recently had a historical flood. Believe it or not, we had in 3 hours over 10 inches of rainfall. And this area here was one of the most saturated areas in the entire Sarasota metro. Some areas here on Siesta Key had over 14 inches of water on the road. In fact, you can see that there's mud everywhere. Now, I'm not sure exactly how deep the water got here in this part of the island, but in other parts of the island, I could see the watermark on buildings, and it was about 14 inches. I'm surprised that there were so many people out and about, considering how much rainfall we have had recently. Naples to the south is still getting pounded with non-stop torrential rain, but Sarasota somehow escaped a lot of the rain on this particular day, and the tourists were out and about, and somehow most of the people I drove today were flying in or out of the airport, and that means that today I got a total of 4 rides out of the airport, which is fairly good. If it wasn't for the airport rides, today's average could have been $12 or $13 an hour, which is very bad considering you're putting in your own gas. So I think considering the day it was and how bad things have been lately in Florida for Uber driving, I think we did pretty well at $21 an hour. I like to make at least $28 an hour. That's where you really feel comfortable Uber driving. But lately, things have been so bad that I'm really not complaining. At least I was able to get 9 passengers over a 5-hour period because things have really been bad with Uber lately. So the person that got my account deactivated was a young lady from Connecticut who had a Cuban sausage fetish. Kept telling her I'm married, I'm not interested, but she continued with her advances. Then she started smoking in the car or vaping. I don't know what it was. I didn't want it to happen. She continued doing it. Eventually, I picked her up there in the apartments near Sarasota. I was supposed to take her all the way back to Venice, but I dropped her off at the Venice Hospital, which is by Interstate 75, because I couldn't tolerate her behavior anymore. She was intoxicated, she was vulgar, she was inappropriate, she was fascinated by the fact that I was Cuban, and she told me about all her Cuban experiences in the past. I told her I wasn't interested. She kept going with it. Then she started vaping in the vehicle. Eventually, I said, hey, lady, I've had enough of you. I'm going to end the ride because you're not going to get to your destination. When I told her I was going to end the ride, she became very upset. She told me that somebody else was paying for the ride and that if I ended her ride, she didn't have enough money to get back because somebody else was paying for the ride. I said, well, you know, if you're in a situation like that, it would serve you good to be respectful. It's not my fault that you can't follow the rules. And if you are, in fact, in a situation where you don't have enough money and somebody else is paying for the ride, maybe then that should be a clue that you need to be respectful and not smoke in people's cars. So that's not my problem. That you can't follow the rules and that you're broke, that's not my problem. That's your problem. And it's not my problem. Now you're going to come here and disrespect me. And after you disrespect me, then you're going to start crying about how you're broke and you're going to get revenge on me because you don't have any money to get to where you're going now because I ended your ride. Lady, that's your problem. If you had been respectful and decent, I wouldn't have terminated your ride. Then when I dropped her off at the hospital, she said it was somebody else's account. It wasn't even her account, so it doesn't matter. And I was like, well, if you're using somebody else's account, that's against the rules. So once again, you're not following the rules, so that's not my problem. I dropped her off at the hospital, and I stayed alive on Uber, and I did 4 other rides that night. She made a complaint saying that I had a heart attack. Now, I didn't know anything about this until today, 11 days later, when I got the call from the support team. I was on the phone for over 5 hours in those 11 days just trying to get a hold of them. They finally transferred me to somebody who was the person in charge of doing this thing. He said, hey, man, lady said you had a heart attack and you went into the hospital. I'm like, well, first of all, I drove 4 other people that night right after I dropped her off. So how could I be driving Uber while I was at the hospital with a heart attack? Clearly, this lady, I told her I had allergies, and that was kind of like a really nice way of saying you can't smoke in the car, because even after I told her to stop smoking, she continued trying to smoke. So me telling her I had allergies was like an extra layer of me telling her, hey, it's not even me being a jerk, it's just you can't do it. Well, she wasn't going to respect me either way. So as we're driving through this part of Siesta Key on the north side of the island, you can see the watermark, and you can clearly tell that these areas were in nearly 2 feet of water. Now this is an island, so I would figure that it rained, and as the water flowed off the island, it was 2 feet deep, but it wasn't like, it's an island, so the water should be able to just flow right off the island, which means it rained so heavily that the water didn't have a chance to flow off the island, because how else would an island that has ocean all around it, how was this island ever possibly 2 feet underwater unless there was a storm surge? And there was a little bit of a storm surge, but it wasn't this much of a storm surge. The amount of water that came down all at once, they said it's a 500-year rain event. In other words, never again in our lifetime will Sarasota ever see this much rain come down this quickly. So it really was an odd weather event. Take a look at this house right here on the right they're building. These architects are definitely hitting home runs with some of these properties. They look incredible. So now we're crossing the bridge back into the mainland, heading on Siesta Drive, I believe, into Sarasota. And then we're going to go along the coast, heading north towards the Sarasota airport. Fairly straightforward ride. These people were happy. I played some music for them. They were happy. They put the windows down, and they had a great time. They were from somewhere out in the Midwest, and they're going to be down here enjoying the Sarasota area. They're pretty cool people. Can't really complain about them. I believe they gave me a nice tip as well, which contributed to the day's total of $21 in tips. You can see that Camaro, which is passed on the left. The fender flare on the front is broken off, When you drive a car that's low through the water, you get a lot of weight resistance, and that cracks glass, it destroys fiberglass panels, it absolutely ruins your car. What a lot of people don't really realize is that when you're driving a lowered vehicle through water, there's a lot of weight resistance. And in fact, when you see the vehicles driving through the water, you'll notice that the wheels that are rotating are actually spinning faster than the car is moving, because the car isn't able to tolerate the water resistance, which could be several thousands of pounds. A lot of people don't really realize that they're small vehicles. It's not so much of the water getting into the car and destroying it, which it will, but there's also an element which is called water resistance, which your vehicle's transmission, if it's a small vehicle, may not be able to tolerate that much force. Now, a pickup truck, it's lifted higher off the ground. Think about it as throwing a stone over the water and it skips. On the other hand, think about grabbing a bucket facing the water and trying to drag a bucket through the water. The weight resistance would stop it. And that's exactly what happens when you try to drive a lowered car through the water, is you have thousands of pounds of water resistance, and the engine and transmission are going to struggle, particularly the transmission, and then most likely you end up with water inside the transmission. Literally thousands of people had their vehicles destroyed in this flooding event. Usually when you drive your pickup truck through the water, you want to get your rear end oil changed, your transmission oil and engine oil. You want to check and make sure there's no water inside of those, as well as the air filters and sometimes even the fuel filter. So imagine if you have this BMW that's got a 4-inch or 5 or 6-inch clearance and you drive it through the water, most likely that oil in the transmission is going to get contaminated by flood water, and eventually that in itself will stall out the transmission. But even then, that's a car that's meant to be towing, I don't know, maybe 4,000 pounds is the weight of the vehicle loaded. Imagine now that the water's got in the front of the car something like 5,000 or 6,000 pounds of water weight resistance. So now your vehicle, which is meant to hold 4,000 pounds, is pushing 11,000 pounds, let's say, trying to get through that water. That in itself can destroy your transmission. A lot of people don't really realize that their little cars are not able to move that much water. It just doesn't make sense. But a lot of idiots tried it, and a lot of vehicles were completely destroyed with this flooding event that we recently had here in Sarasota. I remember when I lived in Naples, Florida, I was way out in the Everglades on a fishing trip, and it was getting late, and I drove through some water, and the bill came out to $1,100. We're talking transmission flush, rear end flush. Sometimes your brakes can get water in them, and you have to flush that whole system out. Rear end, housing, transmission, engine oil, you got to just go through and change all the oils, all the filters, anything that could have came into contact with water, and you only have a few days to do it, because eventually the water will corrode the metals in 5 or 6 days. So you really don't want to sit on this water inside your housing or your transmission, because it'll start to corrode it immediately. So you have a limited amount of time to go in there and flush all those liquids out when you drive through water, because if you don't, it's just going to corrode your vehicle. So if you don't have problems today, you'll have them tomorrow. And I think the BMWs have this thing where it takes air from the air filter and uses it back in the injectors, or it like circulates the air from the injectors to the filters. It's like a weird little thing where it sucks air out of the air filter and takes it somewhere else, and that can contaminate your fuel. So at the end of the day, if it's like a BMW or some other weird type of German engineering, that's the last thing on earth you ever want to drive through water. But that is what hundreds and thousands of people in Southwest Florida did, destroying the life out of their vehicles. We're now north of downtown Sarasota. This intersection here had about 2.5 feet of water. You can see here by the front of the Publix. There's actually videos on Facebook about how bad the flooding was here. So it was a lot of water that came down in Sarasota, and luckily it cleaned up pretty good. It drained pretty good. It wasn't like there was a huge drainage problem. It was just there was so much water that came down so quickly that it overwhelmed the system, because again, it was a very rare flooding event. It's unheard of for this much water to fall this quickly. And a lot of people in Sarasota say, oh, I've seen flooding like this many times over 20 years. Yes, but that's like persistent water day after day for a prolonged period. The problem here was that it all happened within like 3 hours. So what can I learn from having my Uber account deactivated for 11 days? Well, first, if you're an Uber driver, you need to record every single passenger that makes you feel uncomfortable. It's better to record it and have that evidence than it is to have to dispute it for 11 days like I did. The next thing that I also realized is that there are some really bad people out there. And if they don't get their way, they'll do anything to try to hurt you. In the case of this vengeful woman from Connecticut, she was very upset that the sausage was already taken. And she was not happy that I turned her down. Me turning her down was a huge hit to her ego. She was intoxicated. She was upset. Also, I picked her up Friday at 3 in the morning. Now, I've told you guys that I really enjoy those late night runs, but those late night runs are packed with the most imbecile types of people you could think of. And I guess another lesson would be that if you're driving late at night in Uber, you're exponentially multiplying the chances that your account could be deactivated because you're dealing with some very ignorant people. On this particular day of Uber driving, I only had one real inconvenience, and it was a gentleman that wanted to stop at the McDonald's drive-thru, but I already had another passenger behind him, so I picked this guy up. He changes the route. He wants to go to the McDonald's, and he's like, look, man, I've been drinking. I don't really know how to use the app too well. Can I just buy you a McChicken or something, for the 2 minutes it's going to take to get to the drive-thru? I said, sure, whatever. I had just got my account reactivated, so I'm really not looking forward to another encounter of that sort. So just to ease the situation, I'm just getting back into Uber driving. I didn't want to force anything. So I was like, sure, no problem. I'll stop by the drive-thru. Well, the drive-thru took about 9 minutes, and I had another passenger waiting. So here's an interesting scenario for Uber drivers. You are having a rider in the car, and that rider decides to change the route, but you've already accepted another ride. If you allow that passenger currently to go ahead and, add another stop, usually that's going to mean that the second passenger is now going to be stuck waiting for you, and they're going to cancel the ride. And that's exactly what that rider did. They canceled the ride. Now, I don't know if that can reflect negative on me, but Uber called me. And they said, hey, what's going on? Are you safe? Why do you stop for so long? And I guess it was one of those deals where I decided, which I said I would never do this, which is to let the customer change the route without using the app. The guy was drunk. He wasn't being bad. And I just got my account reactivated, so I'm not looking for confrontations. But already allowing the passenger to stop at this McDonald's drive-thru, which seemed like a very insignificant thing, actually turned into Uber calling me and the other passenger canceling the ride because I took too long. And this is something you have to be really careful with. Anytime that you do any type of misappropriation while using the Uber app, something can go wrong. There's consequences, and many times the consequences could look bad on you, the driver, for allowing these things to happen. So many times you try to be you can't make everybody happy. And in the case of today, I try to make this guy happy by letting him go through this drive-thru, and it ended up costing me the other rider canceling the ride and Uber calling me to find out what the crap was going on. But then again, if I had told this guy, hey, bro, I can't stop at the McDonald's, then it could have became a confrontation with him, and who knows how he would have tried to retaliate. So sometimes passengers really put you in uncomfortable situations that almost nothing works out. Luckily, on this day, though, I did get 4 rides from the airport, which are usually the best. I didn't receive any incredible tips. I think the biggest tip I received throughout the whole day was like $6, so it wasn't an incredible tipping day. But at least there were tips attached to like 5 of the 9 rides that I took today. Some tips were small, insignificant, but it's better to have small than to have nothing. Now, this guy said if I did his bidding, he would take care of me through tipping. Now, I guarantee you, I have had about 10 people tell me, I will tip you if you do this, and not a single one has ever came through. I have so far not even once had a single circumstance where somebody says they're going to tip you later and it actually happens. They don't. They tell you they're going to tip you and they never tip you. This guy, he could do it overnight. I'm not going to say it was the case with him. I'm waiting out. Maybe he will tip me. He bought me 2 McChickens, which I didn't want 2 McChickens. It was just like, okay, I figured let me just at least get 1 McChicken and get a deal out of this because I know he's probably not going to tip me either way. So I said, hey, don't worry about the tip. Just give me my chicken. Well, he ordered 2 McChickens and he gave me 2 McChickens and I didn't want 2 McChickens. So it never really works out. Now, I'm not going to say this was a bad passenger. He really wasn't misbehaved and I don't think he was misintentioned. but he's just bending the rules, and it put me in a situation where I actually lost a rider catering to his desires and needs. And that's usually what happens when you drive in Bradenton. Yes, he was in Bradenton, and you guys know that I have a little issue with driving in Bradenton because people in Bradenton don't follow the rules. And well, here's another example of picking up a passenger in Bradenton who just about didn't follow the rules, and it led to me getting a call from Uber and the passenger canceling a ride and making somebody wait for 10 minutes while it was raining. I feel really bad for that other passenger. Whole thing literally out of my control. So this raises an interesting question. As you guys know, my strategy became quickly as an Uber driver to immediately challenge misbehavior and put an end to it with confrontation. In other words, letting people know, hey, no, we're not doing this. Now, that is what led me to the situation with Miss Connecticut Sausage Lover, and that is a situation that I don't want to get back into. In other words, I could have played into her misappropriation, and not like all the way, but at least like I could have tolerated her disrespect, dropped her off, and we wouldn't have had an incident. On today's event, I decided to prolong the escalation of the person's behavior by allowing them to go through the drive-thru without using the app, which led to me all the consequences again. So sometimes these Uber passengers will put you in a situation where if you do the right thing, the passenger gets aggravated. But if you do the wrong thing, which is allowing them to do whatever, then you get in trouble either way. So many times, some of these passengers are going to put you in a situation where, well, do I confront them and say, no, we can't do this unless you do it through the app? Then they start getting revengeful and they get angry, and sometimes you have to end the ride because then they get angry. Or do I go the other route, which is now Uber's calling me and saying, hey, why have you been stopped here 9 minutes? The other rider canceled. So I feel like you're between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't matter which way you go about it. Now, my strategy had been head on, confrontational. Don't allow anybody to manipulate you. Let's just put an end to it quickly. We made videos about this, of me just putting an end to stuff real quick. That's usually the way I like to do things. And now I realize with this Connecticut sausage lady that that's possibly not the way you want to do it, because then they'll retaliate. Well, today we find out that if you, on the other hand, do let them do things that are inappropriate, and then Uber gets mad. So which way do you go? If you are a seasoned veteran Uber driver, do you play into the person's misappropriation? Because it seems like Uber almost wants you so that you don't have consequences. They want you to just allow misbehavior, because if you confront the misbehavior, then you also, it's like, which way do you go? Now, if you're a seasoned Uber driver, let me know, what would you do? Here you have a passenger who says, hey, let me stop at this McDonald's. You're like, well, I know if I say no, then now they're going to be upset against me and they're going to try to retaliate and all that. This guy was intoxicated. He wasn't problematic, but he was intoxicated. That means there's always the potential for unnecessary escalation. I gave in to the guy, not because I wanted to give in to it. My gut instinct was like, oh, no, not at all. If you don't put in the app, we're not doing it. But I know if I did that, now I have an intoxicated person who wants McDonald's, and we're driving past the McDonald's, and I told him up front, give me the McChicken, and I got mine up front, which is still a hustle if you think about it, okay? I still kind of hustled him because he was going to hustle me, because he said he was going to make it right and he didn't tip so far, but I got mine up front, which is a street strategy that I've always known, which is when you're dealing with sketchy people, get yours up front. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a business negotiation with the other party makes me uncomfortable, and I get mine up front, and then the whole deal goes to crap and everybody gets burned except for me. And in this case, I at least got too much chickens out of the deal. But that phone call from Uber and that person canceling that ride could have consequences for me in the future if something were to go wrong. And this is where it gets interesting. So now, as an Uber driver, do I cater to the person's misappropriation? Do I try to drag it on and play it off as much as possible? Because eventually you have to make a decision. In this case, I had a split decision. He says he doesn't know how to use the app, but he'll make it right if he goes to the drive-thru. Now, my idea is, okay, well, give me a water, give me a bottle of water, give me that. Well, now you're at the drive-thru for 9 minutes, and there's another person waiting, and they cancel the ride. So It's like with this whole Uber driving thing, eventually, no matter what you do, you're going to find yourself in a circumstance where things are going to not work in your favor. And you're trying to be the best Uber driver you can. But I'm telling you, some of these passengers, whether they're doing it on purpose to be malignant or like, I don't think this guy was being malignant, but he really put me in a crappy spot. Don't think it was intentional. I don't think he was trying to be a jerk or trying to get me in trouble. I don't think none of that, okay? But he did put me in an interesting situation where now Uber's on my end and another rider's canceling the ride. So it put me in a tough spot as a driver. All that falls on me. It actually messes up my cancellation rate. Now I had 11 days to think long and hard about what I was going to do when a passenger starts doing things that I know eventually are going to lead in the wrong direction. And in the case of this guy, again, I don't think he was being malignant. I just feel he really was probably too drunk to figure it out or whatever. I don't think he was malignant, but his behavior, whether intentional or not, made me have consequences with the Uber app. But again, in Bradenton and at night, I should have known better. So I would love to hear the seasoned veteran Uber drivers. What would you do in this circumstance? You could tell the person, hey, I have another person waiting. I can't do it. I'm sorry. But now this person's driving past the McDonald's and they want it. They're drunk and they may not be happy with the results. Experienced Uber drivers, let me hear your opinion. How would you handle this circumstance? The person says, hey, I want to make a stop. I don't know how to use the app. I'm kind of drunk. I'll buy you something from the menu. I took the chance hoping that the drive-thru would be quick. It took about 9 minutes. The other person canceled. Uber called me. What do you do? Now, he's watching my phone call, so he saw that Uber called me, and he also saw that the other person canceled the ride, so he saw right in front of me that what I did for him burned me. Now, let me check the phone one more time. He could still come through with a tip to make up for it, which he said he would, but he also might think that those 2 McChickens that I really didn't even want were going to buy me out for all this misappropriation. Now, Uber charged him more money for the delay, but he didn't tip like he said he would. So in total, a $6 ride turned into an almost $11 ride because Uber did charge him for that time that took place. On top of that, besides all that, I got 2 McChickens, which would bring the total for the ride for $14. So we turned a $6 ride into a $14 ride, but we upset one passenger who was waiting in the rain. Very disappointing. Anyways, I don't think he did it on purpose, and he saw the results in front of him of how everything really didn't work out. If it had been a slow night and there hadn't been somebody waiting behind him, it really wouldn't have been a problem. But I was taking him to the island, so I had to accept that other ride. I didn't really have a choice but to accept it because late at night on the island, you don't get too many rides on the Bradenton side. On the Sarasota side, there's always another ride. On the Bradenton side, I've waited for hours for another ride. And again, I feel really bad for that person that was waiting for me for 8 minutes while we sat still in this drive-thru. I'm sure they had their reason to cancel the ride. I don't think there was any malignant intention in anybody's behavior here, but we're just contemplating as Uber drivers, how would you have handled it? Me, I let him do whatever, and I took the chance, and everything fell back on me. So that's what I did, and I did it to avoid confrontation because I just got my account back today, and the last thing I want is to continue having confrontations with people. But it seems that if you don't confront people, you have consequences either way. So you can either go out like a boss or you can go out like a simp. I don't even know how to describe this situation. But the good thing was that after I dropped off this McDonald's passenger, I did actually get another passenger that was heading off the island back the way I was going. So it could have all worked out for the better if there's no problem with that one passenger canceling. Now, every single time that I have had a passenger ask me to stop somewhere, Uber calls me and says, "Are you okay?" Uber doesn't let you stop on their dime. If you stop somewhere, they're still going to charge you. And that's maybe what I'm going to start telling the passengers, because this guy's $6 ride turned into an $11 ride. So I'm going to tell the passenger, if I stop, Uber is still going to charge you more money for the ride when they realize that we stopped somewhere. And that right there may be a monetary incentive for the person to know, hey, you're still going to have to pay for this. So that's what I'm going to tell people in the future. When somebody says, hey, I don't know how to use the app, like, it's going to cost you the same amount of money, because either way, when the Uber app figures out that we stopped somewhere, the clock is going to start ticking and you're going to have to pay for that increased time. So it seems like that may be an incentive for the person to say, okay, let me just go ahead and do it the right way through the app. Even though they say they don't know how to do it, a lot of times they do it. But if they're true drunk, they'll mess it up. I've even had people take me to the wrong direction because they're drunk, and they'll put the arrival site as the destination, and you go pick them up where you're supposed to drop them off. And that happens quite often with people late at night. But the problem is Bradenton. See, this type of crappery doesn't really happen everywhere. Now, I have discovered a trend. Yes, I have a trend. There's a particular apartment complex, I'm not going to say the name, but there's a particular apartment complex near Interstate 75 and Fruitville. It's a newer apartment complex. And I have had several problematic passengers out of this nice looking apartment complex. The first time I went there, I was like, wow, well, this looks nice. But despite the fact this bougie looking apartment complex looks nice, I've had quite a few problematic passengers come out of this nice looking apartment complex. Interesting. In fact, one night I had a girl who was drunk and tried to jump the fence. It seems like there's a lot of partying going on late at night in this apartment complex that looks fancy, but based off the people I'm picking up in this apartment complex, yeah, there's some interesting behavior going on. The last passenger of the night was some people we picked up right here in the heart of Bradenton Beach. And they were heading back the way I was heading far inland. So it worked out pretty good to get this passenger heading the same direction I was going.